March 1945. The air smelled like wet ash and diesel, like something old being burned down to make room for something that hadn't arrived yet. The towns on the outskirts of Aschaffenburg were half rubble, half ghost, walls still standing but hollowed out, windows gone, doors hanging crooked on broken hinges, and yet people still lived there. They swept their steps in the morning. They hung laundry between damaged buildings. They did the stubborn, ordinary things human beings do when the world is collapsing, because routine is the only armor the unarmed have. Now, get this. General George S. Patton's command jeep is rolling through one of these shattered streets. His driver, used to impossible roads and the general's sudden demands, has been navigating rubble for hours. Then, without warning, Patton says one word. Stop. Not shouted, just said. With the kind of flat, absolute authority that doesn't need volume behind it. High above, through a break in the cold spring clouds, an Allied aircraft is spiraling downward, trailing dark smoke like a wound across the sky. The sound reaches the ground before the image fully registers, a low, grinding moan of a dying engine that anybody who's heard it never quite forgets. But Patton isn't looking at the plane. He's listening to the street. Because from somewhere close, shockingly close, comes another sound entirely. Laughter, clapping. The bright, festive noise of people celebrating something wonderful, a group of German housewives standing on their porches, some leaning on garden fences with their arms folded, smiling like their team just scored. They were cheering for the plane going down, for the man inside it. Patton stepped out of the Jeep. Before we go any further, I need you to actually feel what it meant to fly in those planes. Because it's easy, from 80 years of safe distance, to read a line in a history book and let it wash over you without weight. The young men flying over Germany in the spring of 1945 were mostly barely old enough to shave. Farm boys from Iowa, kids from Brooklyn tenements, sons of Polish immigrants, coal miners' children from West Virginia, trained fast, shipped out faster, dropped into an air war that killed with terrifying, almost industrial efficiency. According to the archives of the United States Army Air Forces, the casualty rates among bomber crews were, at certain points, statistically catastrophic. You had a better chance surviving infantry combat than completing a full tour of bombing missions. Think about that for a second. Inside those planes, temperatures at altitude dropped to 40 below zero. Frostbite was routine. Men lost fingers. The oxygen masks left pressure sores on their cheekbones. And then came the flak, anti-aircraft fire that didn't announce itself. 1 second, the sky was clear. The next, it was full of black shrapnel bursts capable of tearing through the thin aluminum skin of a bomber like paper, capable of tearing through the man inside just as easily. When a plane was hit, they had seconds to fight the G-forces, to get to a hatch, to pull a cord and fall into freezing air over enemy territory, not knowing what waited below. Sometimes it was capture. Sometimes it was a soldier who followed the rules. And sometimes it was a mob. These were the boys those women were clapping for. If you believe basic human decency should never be abandoned, even in a bitter global war, hit subscribe and leave a like right now. We're diving into a true story of moral courage that shows exactly who Patton really was beneath all that armor and legend. If you think civilians should never celebrate the suffering of a fallen soldier, regardless of what uniform he wore, type the word honor in the comments right now. Let's go back to that street. To understand the depth of Patton's reaction, you have to understand what had happened to the German civilian mind over the previous 12 years. It wasn't simple. It never is when ordinary people do terrible things. Because these were not monsters on that porch. That's the chilling part. These were women who made soup, darned socks, worried about the price of bread. Ordinary people. And yet, here they were. Here's the thing about real state-level propaganda. It doesn't turn you into a different person overnight. It's patient. It works the way water works on stone, not with one dramatic crash, but with constant, quiet repetition until the stone changes shape without ever realizing it happened. For over a decade, these people had been soaking in it. According to the National Archives and post-war psychological studies by the Allied military government, the Nazi regime had constructed one of the most complete information environments in human history. Controlled newspapers, radio broadcasts calibrated to hit specific emotional frequencies. Fear one day, pride the next, rage after that. Mandatory rallies designed not to inform, but to physically immerse people in shared emotion, to make dissent feel not just dangerous, but almost physically impossible. The Allied pilots weren't called pilots. They were called Terrorflieger, terror flyers, not soldiers doing their duty, not young men who wanted to go home, murderers, savages bombing innocent children out of pure malice. Say something enough times, with enough authority behind it, enough community reinforcement around it, and the brain accepts it like any other basic fact. The sky is blue, water is wet. Those men falling from the sky deserve to fall. The women on those porches weren't cheering because they were evil. They were cheering because evil had been poured into them, slowly, carefully, one spoonful at a time, until they couldn't taste it anymore. And that, according to historians who studied civilian behavior during the occupation, was the most terrifying thing the Nazi regime ever accomplished. Not the armies, not the weapons, the minds. The ordinary, everyday minds of ordinary, everyday people, quietly reshaped into something that could smile at a burning plane. If you find it terrifying how easily the human mind can be turned against its own empathy, if you believe propaganda is one of the most dangerous weapons ever invented, type the word mind in the comments right now. Now, back to the man stepping out of that Jeep, the Hollywood version of Patton. The slapping, the profanity, the ivory revolvers, and the grandiose speeches. That's real. But it's only the surface. Underneath all that noise in theater was something considerably more complicated, and in some ways, considerably more dangerous. He had served in the trenches of the First World War, not commanded from behind a desk, served in the mud. He had been severely wounded and kept going. He had watched men he knew, men he'd eaten breakfast with, come apart in ways that don't belong in polite company. And from those years of intimate proximity to the very worst human beings can do to each other, he had built a philosophy about war that was almost medieval in its moral clarity. His own diaries, War as I Knew It, and the surprisingly tender letters he wrote home to his family make it plain. Patton believed combat was a sacred contract between armed men. You could be ferocious, you could drive your enemy into the ground without mercy and sleep soundly afterward. But it was a contract. It had terms. And one of those terms was carved into the bedrock of everything he held holy. Once a man was helpless, unarmed, captured, wounded, falling burning from the sky. He was no longer a target. He was a human being at the mercy of fate, and you treated him accordingly. Not out of softness, out of the specific, hard-won dignity that belongs only to people who truly understand what war costs. These women had never slept in mud, never dragged a friend across open ground under fire, never made the split-second decisions that haunt soldiers for decades afterward. They had been perfectly, completely safe on wooden porches in their intact neighborhood. And they were laughing at a boy experiencing the most terrifying moments of his young life. It didn't just anger him, it disgusted him at a level that anger can't quite reach. If you agree, there's a code of honor that must survive even the most brutal chaos of war. Type the word respect in the comments right now. He walked toward them slowly. That's the detail that matters most. Not running, not charging. Slowly. The heavy rhythmic clap of his polished cavalry boots on wet cobblestones. Each step unhurried, deliberate, like a man with nowhere else to be. The 4 silver stars on his helmet caught the pale spring light. His hands stayed at his sides. He didn't reach for the revolvers. He didn't need them. The women saw him coming and the laughter stopped. Not gradually, just stopped. Like someone cutting a wire mid-current. Now imagine you're one of those women. You were just clapping, feeling that strange electric charge of a crowd sharing something cruel together. Then you look down the street and see 4 silver stars moving toward you. And in one lurching heartbeat, you realize exactly who is walking toward you. The commander of the United States Third Army, the man whose tanks are currently dismantling German infrastructure like a hammer through glass. And he is not yelling, he is not rushing, he is walking toward you with the patience of someone who has nowhere else to be. That's when the smiles died. His anger. And this is what history tends to miss because it's always looking for the loud, dramatic explosion. His anger was not hot. It was Arctic, the kind of cold far more terrifying than heat because heat burns itself out. Cold settles in. Cold stays. He looked at them the way a surgeon looks at a patient before the first incision. Not with hatred, but with a precise clinical attention that strips you of more dignity than hatred ever could. Because hatred at least acknowledges you as a threat. This was something else. This was assessment, evaluation, a quiet, devastating verdict. He swept his gaze across their faces, slowly, holding eye contact, not letting anyone look away, making each woman feel, individually, personally, seen. Not as a crowd that could spread responsibility thin enough to disappear. Each one of them, alone, standing in front of those cold gray eyes. He spoke through his military interpreter, measured, precise, unhurried. He asked them what was funny, not sarcastically, genuinely. What exactly did they find amusing about a young man falling from the sky? He pointed one leather-gloved finger upward at the dark trail of smoke still hanging in the cold air like a scar, held it there. Then turned that same finger, slowly, toward them. He told them who that young man was dying for. He stripped away a decade of propaganda in plain, brutal sentences and told them that the boys in those planes, the boys they were laughing at, were the direct reason they would be alive in 6 months. That it was those kids taking that flak, burning in those cockpits, who were going to hand them back a future worth having. Then he asked them, still calm, still surgical, never once raising his voice, how they planned to look American soldiers in the face when those same soldiers came to hand out food rations, to bring medicine, to stand between those women and the Soviet army pressing in hard from the east. Were they planning to laugh at those soldiers too? Or was the laughing only for when the boys were helpless and on fire? Nobody answered. Nobody could look at him. The cobblestones suddenly became the most interesting things in the world. Women who had been clapping 60 seconds ago were now staring at the ground with the specific, nauseated expression of people confronting something about themselves they can never fully unknow. He didn't threaten imprisonment, didn't reach for the revolvers. He used something far more permanent than any of that. He used the truth, raw, undecorated, aimed with the precision of a man who spent 30 years learning exactly where words hit deepest. If you believe truth, delivered without hesitation, without apology, is the most powerful weapon a real leader carries, type the word truth in the comments right now. But a speech was never the end of anything for Patton. A speech was just the setup. He knew, and this is where the real genius sits, he knew that emotional confrontation fades. You go back inside, make tea. The brain builds its quiet defensive walls around painful realizations, softening the edges until the whole thing becomes easier to live with. 2 weeks later, the speech is a blurred, unpleasant memory you've half-talked yourself out of. Patton had studied enough history to understand this, so he gave them something they couldn't soften. He issued a calm, non-negotiable order to his security detail. Quiet as asking someone to pass a map. He had his military police gather the women who had been cheering and the bystanders who had watched silently and said nothing because silence had its own complicity in Patton's code, and told them they were going for a walk, out of their comfortable neighborhood, through the muddy fields on the edge of town, to the crash site. He gave one explicit instruction: treat them with complete respect the entire time. No roughness, no cruelty. This was not revenge. What he was doing was far more deliberate than revenge, and in its own way, far harder to shake. He was going to make them smell it. Because war, from a porch, is an abstraction, visual, safely distant. It doesn't reach through your nose or your hands or the soles of your feet. Patton understood, in his bones, because he had spent decades inside the physical reality of combat, that real understanding doesn't live in the mind. It lives in the body, and the body needed to be present at the thing it had celebrated. They walked through the mud, cold, dark, churned mud that sucked at their shoes and soaked through their stockings, the kind of mud that smells like iron and old earth and something else, something less nameable. Then they were there. The smell hit them before anything else. Aviation fuel has a particular smell, thick, chemical, almost sweet in a way that is immediately and completely wrong. Mixed with scorched earth and scorched metal, the smell of something that was supposed to fly, brought violently to ground. Some of the women put their hands over their mouths, not performing, just reacting. The way any human being reacts when the nose delivers information the mind wasn't ready for. Patton ordered them to work, to clear debris, to carefully, respectfully fold the deployed parachute, that heavy canvas the pilot had trusted with his life, and set it aside properly, to help secure the area, in silence. They worked with their hands in the mud and the fuel-soaked earth. Nobody spoke above what was necessary. The only sounds were the wind, the distant rumble of artillery further east, and the quiet, wet sounds of people working in a field that smelled like the end of something. And they wept. Not all of them, but enough. Not the performed kind, not the weeping someone does because they think it's expected, the kind that rises from somewhere below the conscious mind, the kind your body produces when it has finally been handed enough physical truth to override what the brain spent years being told to believe. An hour ago, they were clapping. Now, they were on their knees in the mud, folding the parachute of the boy they'd been clapping for. And the propaganda, all those years of patient, dripping, carefully constructed propaganda, didn't survive the smell. It couldn't. Nothing that abstract ever survives when reality gets close enough to breathe. Patton watched from a distance. According to the officers present that day, he looked tired more than anything. The specific tiredness of a man who has seen too much of what human beings are capable of and understands, on a deep and worn-out level, that this moment in this muddy field is both necessary and terrible, and one of 10,000 such necessary, terrible things a war demands before it ends. When he was satisfied the lesson had fully arrived, not in the mind, but in the body, he got back into the jeep and continued his advance. If you think forcing people to face the physical reality of their actions is the most honest way to restore the empathy that hate destroys, type the word lesson in the comments right now. Here's what I keep coming back to every time this story surfaces. The easiest thing in the world, in the spring of 1945, for a man like Patton, would have been to look at those cheering women and feel nothing but contempt, write them off, see them as exactly what they looked like in that moment, small, cruel, complicit, and drive past. He had a war to finish. Nobody would have blamed him. Nobody would have even noticed. He stopped. He stopped because he understood something about war that gets buried under the battle maps and casualty figures and sweeping historical narratives. He understood the military victory was only half of it. That what determined whether all those deaths actually meant anything, whether Europe came out the other side with any real chance of becoming something better, was whether the people living in it could reconnect with their own humanity. He wasn't naive. One afternoon in a muddy field wasn't going to undo 12 years of systematic dehumanization. Some of those women would rebuild their walls around the experience, soften it over time. But some of them wouldn't. Some of them would smell aviation fuel for the rest of their lives and remember exactly what it felt like to kneel in that mud, folding that parachute. And no, in the deepest, most physical way a person can know anything, what they had been cheering for. That's what he was after. Not punishment, something older and less negotiable. The forced, unglamorous, muddy knees recognition that there is a human being inside every burning plane. That no uniform, no ideology, no years of carefully fed hatred actually changes that fact, no matter how loud and how long the lie is told. In this age of screens, where it has never been easier to celebrate the misfortune of someone you've decided is your enemy. From the complete safety of wherever you're sitting right now. Patton's afternoon in Aschaffenburg is not a curiosity from old books. It's a mirror, a direct question aimed at all of us. When the plane goes down and the person falling is someone you've been told to hate, what do? Do you keep clapping, or do you remember? Patton stopped the jeep, walked toward the thing everyone else was content to cheer at from a distance, and demanded, quietly, coldly, with the full weight of everything he'd seen and carried, that people look at what they'd done. That's what real leaders do. Not just in war, anywhere, in any organization, in any family, in any community trying to figure out how to treat each other. They don't drive past the failure because they have more important places to be. They stop, they walk toward it, and they make everybody stand in the mud and understand exactly what they've been clapping for. If this story hit something in you, if it made you think differently about how hatred is built and how decency can be demanded back, hit subscribe, leave a like, and pass this on to someone who needs to hear it. These stories don't surface on their own. They have to be carried forward, one person at a time. Thank you for watching. I'll see you soon.